thank everybody for joining with us today. I'm so excited. I can't contain it. So let me share screen so that you too can share in my joy. Happy Pride Month to everybody out there. And so happy to sponsor this presentation about best practices in intersectional LGBTQ plus affirmative care. I'm so happy to have my friend Tyler Lefevre here with us, and we'll both introduce ourselves later. Just wanted to provide some additional orientation. You can use the chat for questions, and we'll still get them because our lovely administrative support is going to text us the questions. You can also use, just in the spirit of learning new things, you can also go to slido.com or scan this QR code and submit your questions that way. So if you do it that way, then your questions actually go up on the screen when you ask them at the opportune time. So this is a neat tool that you guys can all use whenever you give presentations. So you can either go to slido.com and just enter this code. You don't need the hashtag, but UCEBT Pride, or you can scan the QR code. And this is not the first time you'll see it. So if you miss it now, you'll get it later. That's fine. So here are the learning objectives that we promised today to identify some key aspects of sexuality development, gender development, and just other types of identity development in the LGBTQ plus population. Describe being ways that you can use some evidence-based principles or tailoring existing interventions for your intersectional LGBTQ plus populations, and to be able to identify resources for seeking additional consultation and learning. And so how we are going to do, first Slido test for you. What are you hoping to learn? So you can go to slido.com and enter in this hashtag without the hashtag UCEBT Pride, or you can scan the QR code and tell us, what are you hoping to learn? Or if new technology is just the challenge for 10 a.m., you can put it in the chat if you want. So go ahead and say, what are you hoping to learn? It should pop up if you're doing it. Testing now to make sure that it's in. There we go. This is lovely. Better intersectional therapists, support students in schools is awesome. More in depth on intersectionality. Current best practices, how to be supportive. Teen clients, bless you, whoever's got those. I love teens. Teens bring lots of learning opportunities, I'll say. Cool. I'm going to move on, but all of your learning goals are important to me. So we will position ourselves and then we'll go back and forth in presenting the material today. So we'll go over some terms, identity development frameworks, do a literature review. And I think a lot of what we'll go over today will focus on intersections of spirituality with race as well, and talk about some of the ways that we apply this clinically and give you some stuff to go home with. So first I want to just position myself. You see that I am Black, hopefully. So I'm a Black cisgender female. And I guess when I think about this, I identified kind of four main like touch points that sort of describe myself to you. So I'm active LDS. This is a Washington, D.C. temple, which you can go see right now. It is open to the public. And this is where my family got sealed, which means that, we believe we have an internal binding family relationship. And so I think that this idea of eternal binding family relationships is something that has kept me in the church over the years through different challenges. We were the only Black family in our congregation for a long time. And so being Black did not necessarily set me apart in the South, because there's plenty of Black people, but being Black and a girl and LDS certainly did. And so this has kind of become part of my shtick, that before I knew that intersectionality was the word, this is kind of how I always thought of myself, that like you couldn't just see me as a Black person, because being LDS, I was not a part of many social circles that other Black people were a part of because of my religious experiences. And so it's become a defining thing. And then when I was in probably 7th grade, I picked up a teen magazine from the library, and somebody, whatever, that's not important. I was going to say somebody had like taken some modeling pictures, and they're like, "Ooh, I'm in this issue." And I'm like, "Okay, whatever, I'll look at it." And so in, I hope, this magazine, there was an article about Harvey Milk High School, which is in New York, and it talked about how they set up this school for LGBT kids, so that they could feel safe and graduate school. And they talked about some of the outcomes where people were just not doing very well in their schools of origin. But at this place, there was a small cohort of kids that could feel safe. And so at this point in the South, especially, which is like pretty religious environment, I did not know any gay people. So reading this article was a new experience for me in terms of thinking about sexuality. But I was like, hey, this makes sense that people need safe spaces. And so it kind of became incorporated into values consistency that way. And then like years later, when I started graduate school, there's a lot of talk. So this is Julia Ward. And I don't know if people remember this, but about 20 years ago, this person was in a counseling psych program, and they identified as Christian. And when they got gay clients, they wanted them to be referred, like she didn't want to see them. And so it started this whole like inner school process, but also a legal process of essentially expelling her because she would refuse to see clients. And she felt that because of her deeply held religious beliefs, that this should not have happened, that there should be some sort of freedom of religion within schools. And so when I entered graduate school in 2010, there was a lot of hullabaloo about this. I went to a Jewish graduate school, and so I think that people were especially concerned. And then on an APA level, people were just trying to like tamp down what was going on. They didn't want an excess of legal issues around trainees not wanting to see clients. And I remember being curious about this on an intersectional level as a religious person. And but I don't think I was aware of just how my positionality, and being Mormon is complicated because people don't often think of me as Christian, especially in the South, but I think of myself as Christian. And so I was not aware of like my positionality and power in the sense of being, a straight Christian person. And so when I was starting to think about research interest, I said, I want to study this issue about like people who are religious seeing gay clients. And I was steered by loving mentors to say, why don't you look at the intersection of religion and sexuality in the client experience? And so I'm grateful for that steering, because I think that it has given me like an enduring values consistent approach to this issue. Not that looking at my experience is not important, but I think that there are just more important things. Focusing on client lives, I think, is an important thing. And so then I did my research project on the intersection of religion and sexuality in mostly LDS communities, and I presented in Toronto, which is hopefully where I met Tyler. It was either at that conference or the conference before in DC. Okay, I believe it was that one. And so I, like, in reflecting on this, I just have a lot of gratitude for like this, like all of the different steps that kind of brought us together, because we ended up sharing a lot of, I think, socialization to look at the world in the same way, but also just a lot of shared value consistencies. And so it's just been really nice to think about doing this with him. And I see myself as competent in this area of intersectional LGBTQ care, but like Tyler is for sure batting cleanup on this. And so I'll turn it over to him to introduce himself.
Thanks, Kimberly. Yeah, it was at APA in Toronto. But yeah, at that point I was in grad school too. I think we were in grad school about the same time. And I had just come out, or I'd come out a year or two earlier, and I was excited to see someone else doing research with LGBTQ folks from religious backgrounds. So I also, Kimberly and I share many identities, and then some important points of divergence, which I hope will kind of enrich our session today. Oops, there was presenter view. So I identify as a white cisgender man who's queer, Mormon, and a psychologist. For me, I resigned from the LDS Church, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a handful of years ago, but I really embrace Mormon as a cultural identity. It explains a lot about how I interact with my family, the world, that I still prefer dessert over alcohol, that a board game night sounds better than clubbing. To me, that's part of my Mormonity. I got married about a year ago now, to my husband, this really beautiful chapel in the middle of Arkansas. And he's just been a wonderful source of support in my life. And I had a lot of my own journey as a queer Latter-day Saint, which I probably mostly won't share, but those experiences deeply inform the research and the work that I do. Because essentially I found and find myself at this nexus between religious and sexual identities, because all of my family are active members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and we still have close relationships. And then many of my friends are LGBTQ+, which means that I feel like I'm not in a space to dismiss either worldview. So the research that I do, I'm an assistant professor of psychology at Utah State, and my research focuses on the mental health of LGBTQ+ people raised in conservatively religious backgrounds. And I see myself as a bridge builder, someone who's trying to connect communities, help people to see different various perspectives, see the ways that their actions are causing harm or damage to the world, and ways that we can all work together better. Super happy to stay in touch. I see a few faces I recognize, or actually not faces, just names in the audience. One of the biggest shames to me of doing this over Zoom is not being able to actually chat after. So would love all the emails, follow-ups, chats in the chat box as we're going, even if it's just hi or whatever. I would love to connect too. Kimberly and I thought we would start by just reviewing some basic terminology, which I imagine many of us already know, but I want to just go through it so we're all on the same page as we're talking about sexual orientation and gender identity. I recognize that these are really loaded subjects and that it's a lifelong journey. The idea of multicultural competence and never being sure exactly how to speak and position ourselves is the way it is. Just this week, I got called out for new language or language that I was using that was harmful, and I approach this with humility and openness. But these are the things that I've learned. So when we talk about sexual orientation, I think it's really important to understand it as a multidimensional construct, which usually the base is sexual attraction. So in a room of naked people, who do you look at? And then sexual behavior goes on top of that. That's who do you touch in that room? And I think about sexual behavior really broadly. That can include like sexual intercourse, but it can also include like holding hands or kissing, this idea of expressing sexual attraction through physical contact. On top of that is sexual identity. So how do I talk about what I did in this naked room of people? How do I describe myself? How do I communicate myself to other people? On top of that is this idea of community. People often talk about the LGBTQ+ community. I have a really strong aversive reaction to that language because I have not found the LGBTQ+ community. I think there are LGBTQ+ communities that exist. And my experience, my personal experience, and the experience of many of my friends is that most of us don't feel a part of a particular community. Many of us have shared identities, but there isn't this sense of like, oh yeah, we go to the Pride Center to hang out every Friday night, which community kind of entails. So I think about, and then there's a movement on top of that. So we're thinking about LGBTQ plus rights and love on the top, because love conquers all. But I organize them like this because this is roughly the order of prevalence in the population of people with that hold each of these aspects of sexual orientation. So we see the broadest swath of people identifying as some degree, experiencing some degree of same-sex sexual attraction, slightly less, evidencing some sort of same-sex sexual behavior, fewer still who identify as LGBTQ+, fewer still in the communities, fewer still who are sociopolitically involved, and the heart is just for fun. A quick note with this is that there's different terminology depending on which aspect of orientation we're talking about. And I think this can be really important with clients, especially in the work that I do with religious clients. I see some people making important distinctions between these aspects of identity. And also, I didn't lead with this, but please, 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 I teach. I am so comfortable if y'all interrupt me, if you put questions in the chat. I would rather have people like talking and participating. Oh gosh, Marty, I don't have them. I've got some from a study I did actually while I was an intern at BYU that I'll share in just a second. Actually, I think that will answer your question. It's right here. So I got access to this really great data set from the Center of Collegiate Mental Health, which basically collects data from counseling centers across the United States, and then a little bit of Canada, a little bit of the UK. And what I did is I said, look, if you report some degree of same-sex sexual attraction, behavior, and identity, you're in this group. So the 100% is someone who is all people who said some degree of same-sex sexual attraction, behavior, or identity. And then I said, well, how do these different circles overlap? And it was really fascinating because what we found is that only a third of this group said, look, I experience same-sex sexual attraction, I primarily engage in same-sex sexual behavior, and I consider myself LGBTQ+, which is not the narrative that most of us have in our minds when we think of LGBTQ+ people. We think of probably a white gay man at Pride, cis man. And what this 33.3% is telling us is that there's a lot of people who experience, for example, same-sex sexual attraction, but don't engage in same-sex sexual behavior. And these people might be people who are primarily like bisexually attracted, but in heterosexual relationships, or people who don't engage in same-sex sexual behavior for religious reasons. And similarly, there's about a sixth of people who say like, I've tried that same-sex sex and it was cool, or it wasn't cool, but that's it. I didn't really experience any sort of enduring attraction, and I don't consider myself LGBTQ+. Yeah, thanks, Marty. And for me, this is an important layer to start this conversation with. Usually, I use the terminology sexual and gender minorities to connote this entire spectrum of this 100%. You'll see me flip back and forth between sexual and gender minorities and LGBTQ+. But in my language today, I'm referencing this whole broad spectrum. Gender is also multidimensional, which maybe, I'm not sure if this is better or worse known than sexual orientation. I really love the idea of the gender unicorn. Many of you have probably seen this before. It helps us break up the three components that we think of with gender, which is the sex assigned at birth. So that's what's between your legs, a female, male, or intersex, acknowledging that there actually is a spectrum of sex assigned at birth, whether or not we just don't tend to see a lot of people naked and see that. But if we were to, we would actually see more spectrum. Then, so gender identity is kind of what's between the ears. That's how I think about my gender. And that can align with the sex assigned at birth or not. So if I see myself aligned with the sex that was assigned with birth, I call myself cisgender. If I see myself not aligned, I call myself transgender. And for me, at least in this presentation, transgender is a really broad umbrella term of just saying like that my gender identity doesn't match what's expected based on my sex assigned at birth. And then gender expression is how I convey that to others. So I could be a transgender man and still present femininely. And I think it's important to understand that gender expression is not always tied to identity, and vice versa. Some people express their gender in very feminine or androgynous ways, but still would identify within the gender binary. The biggest takeaway for me, at least, to open this presentation is that there's this really wide spectrum of what we think of when we think of gender minorities. And the last thing I want to give you to set the stage is a list. I wanted a list of the things to say and not say. And so here's my list for you. Don't say homosexual. If we had more time, I would have you answer what we should say instead. Instead, we'll use same-sex. So as an adjective, like even homosexuality, let's say same-sex sexuality. Homosexual has pathological connotations to it. But even though it's technically accurate, it's a really burdened term. Don't say transgendered or transsexual, the ED or sexual, say transgender. Similarly, for like medical references that are no longer accurate. We don't really say gays, bisexuals, or lesbians. And this is more in the sense of person-centered language. We're going to talk about these people as individuals. So gay individuals, bisexual individuals, lesbian individuals. You heard my rant about the LGBTQ plus community. I think we should say communities instead. Yes, Greg, you will get a copy of these slides after the presentation within a week. I also don't like the word homophobic. This is a little bit less, many LGBTQ people wouldn't have reactions to homophobic, but the researcher in me says that homonegative or heteronormative are better ways to think about this idea. Homophobic has connotations of fear, and the idea isn't really that people are afraid of queer people, it's that they've got negative beliefs or normative beliefs from their own perspectives that are harmful. Preferred pronouns is a no, they're just pronouns. Unless you prefer, we don't call preferred pronouns for cisgender folks, so please let's not call that transgender folks as pronouns preferred. We don't really like biologically or genetically male or female, assigned male or female at birth, but actually I would say we probably just don't even need to talk about it. Rarely does it matter the sex people were assigned at birth. Most of the time what matters is the gender they identify as. Something that I feel like as a field we're just starting to grapple with is male and female are actually terms that typically refer to sex when they're used as nouns. So saying I'm a male actually tells you that I have a penis, but it doesn't tell you that I see myself as a man. And men and women is the gender term that's saying how I see and present myself. It's taken me years to really like sit with the sex gender difference, and I study this. But what I would give you, especially if you're new to this, is the answer is always gender. Unless you're like a biologist, the answer is always we're talking about gender. Very rarely are we actually interested in sex, and very rarely is sex itself kind of the construct that's most interesting for us. Lifestyle we've mostly moved away from as a society. Just don't. There's like the gay lifestyle, the homosexual lifestyle, just doesn't make sense. Sexual preference also is no bueno, just sexual orientation. Last one, I think, sex change. Yeah, would be better as gender affirmation surgery. So Marty, to your question, yeah, instead of internalized homophobia, internalized either heterosexism or heteronormativity or homonegativity are all kind of interchangeable. I'm doing work in this area, and what I found is that even the researchers can't get it straight. We just can't settle on one word for this. But I see all of those three, just not homophobia. And with that, I think I'm going to pass the ball back to Kimberly to talk about some intersectionality stuff.
Okay, thank you so much. If anybody else is sweating, I hope it makes you feel better that I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm like going through my slides and seeing if I got to edit out any terms. Learning opportunities, friends.
Absolutely.
Okay. So intersectionality is a concept that was coined or most associated with Kimberly Crenshaw. And what is interesting to me, like, especially as we talk about intersections, is I was trying to figure out how to concisely define things. And as you might already gather, conciseness is not my strong suit. And so I went to a previous presentation that I have been given by a white woman who identifies as lesbian. And so she described it as a feminist sociological theory. And I was like, okay, great. And so I added that it was really born from, that swear word, critical race theory, where looking at the law, Dr. Crenshaw would say it's not fully representing what's happening. If you look at what is happening to women in the law, for example, you need to look at Black women, or how we would probably extend it today to can't just look at what happens to Black cisgender women in the law, you look at trans as well. And so it was looking at this idea that we have these socially constructed categories, but that they interact on multiple levels to contribute to systematic social inequality and a differentiation in outcomes of all kinds of things, like both legal and just thinking about emotional well-being, all kinds of stuff. So it really is looking at, it's not that being a member of a quote marginalized community is the bad thing. It's more like how we interact with these conceptualizations of these things, and then how that almost idea interacts with other ideas and then creates systems of oppression. So it makes a difference in how we talk about LGBTQ plus care, because as Tyler mentioned, there's a lot of representation issues in the research and just even in popular media of, racial difference, intellectual difference, all kinds of things. Okay, so this is, oh wait, did I want to do this? Did everybody ask questions that wanted to ask them? We'll hold on to these. Okay, I will go into identity development. So Tyler already talked about these dimensions of attraction, behavior, identity, and this more loosely defined community aspect. I like to think about things historically, because I think when we're talking about dismantling systems of oppression, we have to think about how we've learned them. And so I will explain. A lot of identity developments models were coming out of the 60s and 70s. I'm like, what were we going through as a country? Everybody just wanted to figure out stage, how can we make this predictable? And so Cass, who was actually working with people in Australia, has this model of sexual or sexual identity development that has kind of endured in terms of the way that we think about it on a developmental level. So, starts with the sense of identity, quote, confusion, where people notice that they are different from the people around them in terms of who they have attractions to. And then it develops this curiosity or anxiety around being different. Then people might start to compare themselves to others and look at the impact of what letting people into this part of their life would do in terms of social structure. And then she talks about identity tolerance, where people are, maybe coming out to people or not coming out to people, but they're seeking out other sources of information for understanding identity. Identity acceptance involved in increasing community interaction, even if the inner sense of self is still tenuous. She was still saying this in 1996. It is what it is. I will talk about this later, but so often the research in quote marginalized communities is based on a deficit model or comparison to what the norm is perceived to be. And so it just takes a long time to shake those ideas off, and people will hold on to that for a long time. And so with identity development models, I think that you see that pattern kind of enduring. Anyways, identity pride. So people tend to reject strategies to hide their identity at this point, increase in the community activism. And then the last stage is identity synthesis, where people are able to incorporate other parts of their identity, like their gender identity, their spiritual identity, their racial identity, maybe, if they were saying that back then. So those things. But then people started to think about this differently. And bless Rich Salmon Williams, who himself went through I wonder if he looks back at himself from 1998 and is like, no. But he did have something in terms of thinking about how a stage model may not be the best way to capture this, because when you think about stages, you like go from one to the other and you don't go back, and there's like not a lot of fluidity or flexibility. And so he started to think about it in terms of milestones or touchstones, like can we create sort of shared experiences that people are commonly finding. And so that's where he first started, when he was releasing stuff about identity development. And then he started to get into the dimensions of attraction, behavior, and identity that Tyler already mentioned, and that really has taken off in terms of how we think about just observing behavior as opposed to like putting people on predictable tracks. So, people can grow. It's great. And so this is a model that basically says that these things, first of all, everybody has a sexual identity development. It's not just gay people. And that this is going to be influenced by our environment, by other aspects of our individual identity, by our needs and drives, like what we want from the environment, by our social identity. So all of these things are going to kind of intersect and influence how we identify in terms of sexual orientation. This is how you can have straight people that identify as straight and don't necessarily give a lot of like milestone thought to this. It's because there's all of these powerful like group of membership things that are happening, especially in childhood and adolescence, that some people just do not think, but these things are still active processes that are happening for identity development. Okay, and now gender identity development. Speaking of things that endure, Kohlberg is the one that came up with the stages of moral development, which, is still actively taught to most of us when we're in school. And so he came up with this idea of gender identity development. And so he said that people can say what gender they are around age 3. They feel a stable sense of it around age 5, and they like are for real about it in terms of behavior around age 7. And so if you think about all of the things that we do as a society to go back and reaffirm this Kohlberg stuff, you think about gender identity or gender reveal parties. The prevailing thought back then was that it was a crucial part of a parent's job to help their kids understand what gender they were. So we got to have colors, we got to have toys, we got to have all of these things, or else you're not doing their job. And of course, parents with a fear story around being a good parent will do these things. And so a lot of us still continue to do these things. And then Bandura, our learning guru, talks about how like kids receiving feedback on gender nonconforming behavior is what helps give insight to gender identity. So they would, in that time, depict giving like negative feedback about gender nonconforming behavior as a positive thing, which, it's just not how we think about it, but it is how we think about it whenever we feel sort of like hesitancy to engage around gender issues as therapists. I think it's important to ask ourselves, are we still kind of rooted in some of these ideas? And can we kind of diffuse from that story? And so the model that people ended up coming up with in the aughts relates to kind of the same sense of like cis to trans, like that trans identity is developed in the context of saying like you're by default cis, but then you like look around and you're like, oh wait, that's not the case. And then it takes a while for you to kick around in this stage to a commitment to gender identity as a trans person. And I don't know if anybody else finds it interesting, and I'm about to put on racial identity development model as well. But a lot of these end with political activism as like a means of expressing identity. And, you know, hearing Tyler talk earlier, I'm like, I wonder if even that has outlived its usefulness. And, you know, we push people into like knowing for sure what they are so that they can go out and like represent themselves, but maybe this is not a useful construct to follow. But it's there in our consciousness, so I'm gonna bring it up. I think one of the crucial ways that we've developed some flexibility around gender and sexuality issues is by the influence of the Black community. You know, on the left, we have Marsha P. Johnson, who was integral in the Stonewall riots. And then, you know, there's all this, because you can't hide being Black generally, but there started to be a culture of like down low, like men having sex with men that was like very much normative in the Black community, even if it wasn't in other communities. And so, you know, as with all things Black, sometimes we don't realize that this has influenced like everything about the way we think about things like, you know, hip hop and R&B, but this is the case. And so I think it's important to bring that up. Again, from the 70s, we have this idea of nigrescence or Black racial identity, where people start out with a notion that white is right. And this, you know, I'm willing to challenge this, but up to the present, you know, people know that kids are aware of their racial categories at fairly young ages, and that they still continue to internalize a sense of it's not even forced short in the future on the part of people of color, but just looking at kind of outcomes representation and saying, oh, these are more likely to be smart. This is more likely to be desirable, that kind of stuff. So is happening in the pre-encounter phase. And then the encounter phase, which usually happens in, you know, anywhere from 7 to 10, people of color having their first experiences with racism. And there's this desire to go back into previous states of knowing, which I can acutely remember as like a Black kid. And I'm like, why can't I just go back to like where people weren't talking about my hair or, you know, weren't looking at me funny. I just want to go back. But then in adolescence, you see often people going into these immersion phases where they really want to surround themselves by people who are in their community. And this is happening for white people too. Many people here are probably familiar with the book Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? But like by adolescence, you have this kind of like people are trying to information gather within their racial groups. And so internalized senses of identity again involve the ability to incorporate other identities meaningfully, and also with the political activism, which I think probably of all the models is, I think, fairly enduring in the Black community, but who is to say that this too will not fade in time? So one of my favorite researchers in this area is Jonathan Lasseter. He's just brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. And so he has done a lot of work in Black sexual and gender minority communities, Black sexual and gender minority Christian communities, people living with AIDS. Like he's a dude to follow. And so in an encyclopedia article, he talks about how the research in the Black sexual and gender minority community is often monolithic. So a lot of times the research is lumping all sexual and gender minorities together. So trans people will be in with like Black, gay men and lesbians and all that. It's non-specific in terms of outcomes. So they often don't have the numbers to be able to tease out different outcomes. And the research has been driven by federal funding priorities. And so a lot of the research is around HIV and AIDS. And you know, we're glad to hear it. There still are remarkable disparities in communities of color in terms of like outcomes for AIDS, but that tends to drive the research. And so from his kind of synthesis of it, he talks about how there's this risk of ostracization in multiple communities. And so, people will say that they don't feel welcome in the Black community totally, but then they go to like gay events and don't feel welcome there. They swipe on Tinder and people say like, no, however they say this, I am like too old and too married for Tinder. But there are things that happen on dating apps. And intersectional discrimination is related to the likelihood of mental health diagnoses. Shown this in Black bisexual individuals, but I think that conventionally this is the way that we tend to think about it, and kind of like how ACEs contribute to the likelihood of mental health diagnosis, but not a surety. The influence of intersectional discrimination is like an ACE, like an adverse childhood experience that just, it's like a gift that keeps on giving. Black sexual and gender minorities may develop more positive feelings about their racial identity because, as I've said, that since it's not something that can be hidden, people are forced into Black socialization processes earlier than they would be for sexual or gender development processes. And so this kind of has a mixed result. It can lead to resilience in the midst of multi-level stressors, to be like, I'm Black and I'm proud. But some of the research that they looked at hypothesized that because the emphasis is on developing Black identity, that it might lead to an increase in homonegativity internalized when they're trying to develop a positive sense of sexual orientation identity. And so the research in this area in terms of suicide risk is mixed because the research is so limited. So for any researchers out there, go do it. This needs to be done. Okay, so I'm gonna turn it back over to Tyler, who's gonna talk about, I'm so excited about this, his work that he has done.
Thanks, Kimberly. I also deeply admire John Lasseter's work. He's really doing stuff that not many other people are doing, and often integrates religion and spirituality in his understanding of Black sexual and gender minorities, which is my bread and butter. So I'm going to take probably 20 or 25 minutes, and then I'll do my piece, and then Kimberly, I'll hand it off to you to kind of give your thoughts and wrap up. I know we planned differently, but just thinking about time, I'll sprinkle my clinical insights throughout and then hand it back. So as far as I know, I'm the only researcher who's doing programmatic research on LGBTQ plus Latter-day Saints. And I took some time to just say, like, what have I learned? I've probably been doing this, 7 or 8 years. And what I've got for you is 10 things that I've learned from researching LGBTQ plus Latter-day Saints. And I have more material than we're going to have time for. So what actually I'd appreciate most from all of y'all is your interaction and feedback as we're going. Help me know what feels most relevant to you, what's most interesting. And that will help me pace as we're going through the slides, because my tendency is going to be to breeze through. So stop me. If something's interesting and you're not getting it, let me know. Also, a stats warning for all. There will be lots of graphs and lots of numbers. I'm going to try and speak through them. I've got all of this research is coming from different papers. I don't have all of the references, but I can give them to people after if they want. So divided into two parts. The first are the different ways to be an LGBTQ plus Latter-day Saint, and the second is risks and resources. When I step back from this work, I think a lot of the findings would be true of LGBTQ plus people from a variety of conservative religions or backgrounds, any religious orientation that is kind of a worldview totalizing religion or a high cost religion. So I think about Muslims, evangelical Christianity, some Orthodox Jews that would have similar kinds of patterns and outcomes. Okay, so ways to be an LGBTQ plus Latter-day Saint. I've learned that there are a few different ways to be an LGBTQ plus Latter-day Saint. It's not a one size fits all. Eric Rodriguez and Susan Ouellette came up with 4 ways back in 2000. And this was kind of the first thought. They said, look, either you leave your faith or you prioritize your faith over your LGBTQ plus experience. you integrate the two identities or you compartmentalize them, which I don't know, that seemed reasonable. John Dehlin did a study in 2015 that kind of investigated this. And what this pie graph is showing, look, the colors correspond to Rodriguez and Ouellette's categories, is that there really weren't four ways. There were roughly about two. Either people left their faith or they compartmentalized, at least in his study, which actually had a really big sampling problem and didn't get many conservatively religious folks actually in the study. But the thing that stuck out to me most is very few people were classified as integrating sexual or gender minority identities and LDS identities. I think it's a little different for folks from less conservative religions. I did a study with a few colleagues last year. The years are always weird. We actually wrote this a year and a half ago. And we did a latent class analysis of LGBTQ plus Latter-day Saints, which kind of groups folks into categories based on how they answer questions. We found three different ways. Essentially what we found, though, that separated the different ways of being an LGBTQ plus Latter-day Saint was all religious-oriented variables, that the groups all kind of had the same degree of outness, sexuality support, and identity centrality, sexual identity centrality, which to me says that there's just people are navigating their identities differently. So this this engaged LDS was probably out as same-sex attracted, right? Or out as being in a mixed sexuality relationship. Or they may have gotten sexuality support from other people with their faith, whereas the people who were in the lapsed LDS group probably were out as gay or bisexual and got their support from LGBTQ plus communities. But the things that we really saw that differentiated folks were more in their orthodoxy. So huge differences. There were the people, 156 people who basically answered the highest value on the orthodoxy scale, which is the way to be LDS, at least classically. It's like you're all in or you're all out. So we got a lot of people that were all in, were pretty committed, and went to services. 5 is a scale average of once a week. And then we had people who were kind of in the middle and people who were out. So I think it's helpful to know there's different ways that people do the thing. And one of the biggest shocks that I found is that some LGBTQ plus Latter-day Saints find help and satisfaction in the church. I left the LDS church because it was no longer because it was no longer a compatible place for where I was heading. The church was going to excommunicate me anyway at the time. But my research has shown me that there are people who find help and satisfaction in the church. So I think about 4 different kind of singular relationship options based on religious orthodoxy and desire for coupling. So the more people who are more conservative tend to be in either celibate or in mixed orientation or mixed sexuality relationships. And people who are more liberal tend to be not celibate, looking for a same-sex relationship. And what we found in one of our initial studies, I think I've got all of my sample sizes in my notes. This was 1,782 people. They weren't all LDS, but they were all religious. Was that these people, their average scores for anxiety, depression, life satisfaction, and physical health weren't actually that far from positive spaces. So the people were finding some health and satisfaction, with people finding more satisfaction being in a relationship than being single. So I took away, it's a really tough thing to live a single life. And I'm not really confident that encouraging clients to strive for celibacy is a particular productive mindset for them. Next, I've learned, I think, that most LGBTQ plus Latter-day Saints leave the LDS church and religion generally, and also find satisfaction in health. Let me make sure I'm on the right slide. So I don't know the exact rate of disaffiliation, but in national studies with national data that I've worked with, I've seen that sexual and gender minorities leave organized religion at about twice the rate as heterosexual and cisgender folks. So roughly, it's about 2/3 of heterosexual and cisgender folks who say, look, I'm religiously affiliated, whatever that means, however often I go. And it's about 1/3 of sexual and gender minorities who say, I'm religiously affiliated. I am in the middle of a 10-year longitudinal study. We just collected wave 2 data, which is catching people at 2 years out. And what we found is across the 2 years, this chart is showing that folks' religiousness has all gone down. So the people in the sample were all LGBTQ plus people who were baptized a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at some point in their lives, regardless of kind of current activity. And we had like about 50-50 of people who said, look, I'm active, LDS, I'm not. And what we saw is across 2 years, so wave 1 was 2020 and wave 2 was 2022, is that the entire group was less religious, less committed to their religion. They experienced fewer religious struggles and they went to services less often. And I think that's an important context when working with LGBTQ plus Latter-day Saints, because this is saying that something's happening. There's something in the water, that maybe the well is not a vivacious supply for many people in the LDS church, or many sexual and gender minorities. We also did another study. This is using the data from we collected in 2016 from 1,700 sexual and gender minorities, compared the 4 different relationship options I was talking about earlier, and asked people, compare them on 5 different outcomes. And what we saw was really big gaps. So if you look at the means, these are the numbers you're comparing across. We see that people in same-sex relationships had the least amount of anxiety, the least amount of depression, the most life satisfaction, and the most physical health of all 4 groups. And when we looked at which groups were significantly different from each other, the line was here between people in relationships and people out of relationships. So the most important thing for folks was being in a relationship, that was the most health promoting for them. And then some slight bumps or advantages for being in same-sex relationships for most folks. These are the same graphs by the 4 statuses about satisfaction with their status. And what we see is that people in same-sex relationships were very satisfied being in their status. With people in mixed orientation relationships, overall being about just as satisfied, but just not as acutely satisfied, if that makes sense. So the green are all shades of satisfaction, and the total percentage of green in these 2 is about the same. But kind of some gradations in satisfaction, which really follows really well the couple and family literature. Like if you're in a relationship, you're happy until you're not, because it's really sucks to say like, actually, I'm not really satisfied with this relationship. That probably means I need to do something about it. So people tend to really over-report satisfaction. Okay, so that's my number 3. Number 4, being caught between an LGBTQ plus identity and church membership sucks. And I had maybe 3 or 4 years of suckiness in my personal journey, where I had to refigure out, I basically had to rebuild a worldview for life, because my LDS worldview just couldn't hold my current realities as a queer person. And we see this in the data. We did a qualitative study 2 years ago with 2020 data. And one of the main themes that we found was folks talking about identity confusion and conflict. And like Kimberly was talking about with some of John Lasseter's research, we heard people saying, I just don't fit. Like, I don't know where I fit. I don't fit in church. I don't fit in LGBTQ plus communities. And that's really stressful. Folks saying, I feel like, these are quotes from participants in the study, feels like a damned if I do, damned if I don't. The community surrounding my sexual and gender identity will often belittle or get angry with my church. And I also find that some members of my church are bigoted and do the same towards people, those who are part of my community. And I found absolutely no acceptance in the LGBTQ plus community because of my religious affiliation. And one of the most concrete messages from me from this is that it is really not helpful when we pick sides as human beings. If you're LGBTQ plus, pick your side, do your thing, right? You pick your life side, but as people who care about LGBTQ plus people, including me as a queer person who cares and studies LGBTQ plus people, I think it is really unhelpful to say there is this one best way to live, because that creates this kind of tension that we hear from participants and ultimately causes more suffering and more feelings of trappedness in either or. These graphs are from 2018 data, and we were looking at service attendance, so going to church, and well-being, And what you notice is that there's these really beautiful parabolas, which were all statistically significant. And they showed that when people went to church a moderate amount, they did the very worst, which we interpreted to be like an indication of cognitive dissonance. Because if you're a Latter-day Saint, you should be at church every week. Like that's really not negotiable, or that's really clearly stated. So when people were, they did fine. And when they stopped going, also did fine. But when people were in the middle, it was pretty rough for them. And so really what I took away is it's so hard to be navigating both. And hopefully for most people, this space in the middle is a transitionary space. It's a place where they're really reconciling or understanding identities and making a choice one way or another. But we just, honestly, we don't see very many people sit in the middle of these two identities. There are some like examples, but very, very few. Number 5, labeling matters, but in different ways than you might think. So, I didn't notice this graph is cut off. I looked a lot at people who identify as same-sex attracted, which is what the LDS Church used to encourage LGBTQ plus folks to do. Say, look, you're not gay, just same-sex attracted. And people who identify as LGBTQ. And we looked at how that decision changes outcomes. And so these blue ones are people who are saying I'm same-sex attracted, and these green are people who say I'm LGBTQ plus. And we see that people who are same-sex attracted are more religious than people who are LGBTQ plus. Basically, they're saying, I ally with religious communities, which is one of the functions of identity. It's to connote group membership. And so an SSA identity connotes membership with faith. And on the flip side, an LGBTQ identity tends to connote membership or belongingness with LGBTQ or LGBTQ plus communities. But we just didn't see any differences in mental health, which again, that was surprising. I really expected to see SSA people suffering because that's a lot of narrative around this. And we're still following up on this, but at least from these initial findings, it seems like people are finding support just in different places. And that's what matters, is that they're getting community around either religion or sexual orientation or gender identity. And I should just throw in a caveat, a lot of my stuff is mostly focused on sexual identity, and I really deeply recognize that as a shortcoming. We could guess about the applicability of what I've shared to trans and non-binary folks, but we don't really know. That's a big hole. Okay, I am cruising. Part 2, risks and resources. I apologize for the data dump. I know this is a lot of information super fast, but I'm really happy to answer questions after the fact. So the point 5 about the two identities really got me thinking about a model of how that's possible. How is it possible that LGBTQ plus people are thriving in this homo-negative environment, which the church definitionally is. Its doctrines are objectively homo-negative. And we see LGBTQ plus people thriving there still. And so with some colleagues, James McGraw and Sam Skidmore at Bowling Green State and Utah State, we kind of conceptualized this model of risks and resources, that being an active Latter-day Saint sexual or gender minority and being a non-active or former Latter-day Saint sexual or gender minority kind of predisposed people to different risks and gave them different resources. And this chart was from a study that we did using, I think, 2020 data. I didn't put the N here. I think the sample size was 600-ish. But we were looking at suicide risk. And what we found was you see a lot of the risks were the same across groups, but some mattered more for one group than the other. So for active Latter-day Saints, interpersonal religious struggles were one of the most potent predictors of suicidality, so experiencing conflict at church. And for both groups, concealing identity was a really potent risk for suicidality. Similarly, both groups had similar kinds of support, although the raw amounts of these resources were different. We just thought that they did the same thing. So active Latter-day Saints had a whole lot more family support. But when non-active or former Latter-day Saints had family support, it was still helpful. The differences that we found is that when active Latter-day Saints orthodoxy or their worldview was actually protective or helpful for them. Number 7, one thing that I've learned is that religious struggles are really closely related to health for LGBTQ plus Latter-day Saints. I know many of you who see LGBTQ plus Latter-day Saints probably work with people and you see them struggling religiously. Sarah, I'm just seeing a comment. Does my work include issues for intersex folks? The answer really is no. Like theoretically, yes. And even pragmatically, yes, we include intersex individuals in our samples, but our sample sizes are so small. We're like, in a study of 1,500, maybe 10 folks who identify as intersex. So I think it's probably better to say no, they're not really deeply represented in our sample, though may experience a lot of the same concerns. Yeah, for sure. So we looked, I had been really interested to see how sexual minority Latter-day Saints who are currently identifying as Latter-day Saints compared to heterosexual Latter-day Saints, heterosexual non-Latter-day Saints, and sexual minority non-Latter-day Saints. So I got some Qualtrics survey panels. There were 260 people in each of these groups, at least 260 people in each. And I'm like, okay, let's see how y'all compare to each other. Like, essentially my question was, is it bad to be an LGBTQ plus Latter-day Saint? Because like Kimberly was talking, there's intersectional discrimination and stigma. And we saw the biggest divides between being a sexual minority or not. That was actually the bigger line. So you see the two heterosexual groups had similar degrees of depression, and the two sexual minority groups had similar degrees of depression. Similarly with life satisfaction, which were our two main health kinds of outcomes. What was really surprising to us was to see how the degree of interpersonal religious struggles that sexual minorities experience generally. And the way that this variable is measured, it includes conflict with religious people. They're not all internal religious struggles. And that sexual minority current Latter-day Saints experience the most interpersonal religious struggles. In a paper that's currently under review, we were looking to longitudinally predict how changes in religiousness ultimately affect health. And the social religiousness variable is interpersonal religious struggles. And what we found was that it was the most potent predictor of health and well-being over time. So as people had fewer interpersonal religious struggles, their well-being shot up, their mental health got better, and they had less minority stress. So I think the clinical takeaway is that one of the most important things we can focus on with LGBTQ plus LDS clients is the social aspect of their religiousness. Kind of the degree of heteronormativity or homonegativity there, the types of struggles that they're experiencing, and that by helping them reduce those struggles, we set them up in a better spot to flourish, regardless of how they navigate identities. I'm going to skip the slide since this is a little bit less clinically applicable. I've been fascinated by mixed sexuality or mixed orientation relationships, and have seen one of the biggest takeaways for me is that for these kinds of relationships to succeed, other sex attraction is super helpful. So if we look, this is a Kinsey scale. And if you compare this mixed orientation group to the other groups, you see that they have the most the highest amounts of heterosexual or attraction across the board, which we've seen in other studies, breezing through. But the takeaway is when clients are considering mixed sexuality relationships, one of your questions to them should be, well, what degree of attraction do you feel? Because that's actually going to deeply matter in terms of your health and satisfaction over time. My wrap-up point is that belongingness matters, that we are programmed to look for belongingness, whether in the church, in religious or LGBTQ plus communities, and that finding that belongingness can be really helpful for us. So I'm going to stop here. I know there's a lot of the graphs I didn't fully explain. I'm happy to have follow-up conversations, but I want us to have time to really soak up Kimberly's work in this area too, and kind of some of her clinical considerations.
Thanks so much, Tyler. I am like fangirling over here. That's so rich. Reflecting on Toronto, I think like our paths have diverged, and I'm much more in this like third wave clinical life. And so I was thinking about just things from the research, but also from what I've seen that has been helpful to me in practicing in this community. It says don't use the arrow keys. So for one, change is a constant. Tyler and I were talking about this a little bit when we were planning, just about how remarkable it is that when we were in school, people used to talk about things much differently than they do now. I was looking at a graph or a presentation by somebody to see like what kind of graphics I could take from them. And there was a representation of transgender identity were like kind of these subcategories of identification. I was like, wow, we wouldn't use any of these. Now I have this this graphic of the quilt bag. So quilt bag was one of these like acronym things that circulated for a brief time and seems to still be popular in like the LGBTQ arts community. And it basically means like if you rearrange LGBTQ, you'll get the same in the U as for undecided. But like most of us have not caught on to quilt bag. And even just how important it is to label yourself as a certain thing has like waxed and wanes in importance. And, you know, Tyler brought up some ways that like labeling helps her, doesn't help her. It does things that we don't necessarily think it does. And so I have found it helpful to just radically accept this change and the need to continually work on this. There's been times in my kind of LDS like queer allyship, if I can call it that, intersection, where I've had to step back in the LDS church. You know, we're in Utah, or most of us, I think, and so like I hope it's not too Mormon heavy to talk about LDS issues, but there was what many people refer to as a policy of exclusion, and Tyler kind of referenced for a while they were excommunicating people that were in same-sex relationships and kind of setting up what I believe are pretty morally questionable quandaries between children and homosexual parents. Anyways, so when this happened, there were people in the queer community in the church that was like, oh, this is the worst thing that has ever happened in the history of the church. And as a Black LDS person, I just do not like see it that way. And so there's been reasons just in my personal intersectionality that I've kind of like wished that the world were different than it was. And so I have had to open up continuously as a clinician to just being willing to re-engage, open up to new experiences, new language, pronouns change, like how people think about how they identify change. And I've just found it valuable to like open myself to these things and diffuse from notions of fixed competency. So like I already modeled, like when Tyler was talking earlier, I was like, oh no, what if I said something wrong? And later I'm like, well, what if I said something wrong? Like I can learn. So being able to actively practice diffusion strategies for those things. I want to emphasize that identity development takes place in context. I know that there's some of my HMHI colleagues here. One of the neatest things that I have seen them change, like, you know, I did a lot of PRM work before the pandemic. And so I'm just now coming back to some PRM work. And they've added this dressing model by Hayes into their clinical notes, where Hayes is asking us to consider the interaction of all of these different categories and then some in terms of how people are presenting in the therapy room. And at HMHI, you actually you can't sign a note without saying that you either did or didn't address those things. And the language of it is like, I knew that there was some kind of cultural aspect here that I could have addressed, but I didn't. Do you want to be that clinician? I do not. And so then in general, I mean, I think I'm pretty good about this anyway, but I've been super careful about it now because it matters. It's more than just like a category. It's reflecting on people's lived experiences. And so it's important to look at. And some of the work that I did on my doctoral project, I came across, this was like my first like explicit encounter with the idea of faith development, and that, you know, I could have different identity development tracks I'm on, but also have a religious identity development. In the Mormon community, this is like super popular now, but I like to think I was on the cutting edge. And so when I was looking at the experiences of LGBTQ people, so again, no transgender people, not great, but this is what people were doing back then. So these are some of the quotes and themes that I found in terms of how people thought about their development as a queer LDS person. And the main thing that I took away from this is, like, if you think about many people being on like the trajectory that you expect, if somebody walks into your therapy room and says I'm bisexual, then you might assume that they're on like more of the acceptance, like synthesized, like that end of their identity development. But then if somebody is religious, or especially in the LDS community, and says the same thing, it could mean a lot of stuff. It could mean that they're identifying as bisexual in an attempt to like be more acceptable, or to play into kind of what tend to be notions of religious people that, like, because sexuality is fluid, if I identify as bisexual now, that will change later and I'll be able to be a straight person for you. So it could be actually earlier than you think it is, because LDS people describe like trying to hide their sexuality, trying to live double lives, and then getting a lot of identity conflict and pushback on that. So I think it's important to remember. I also just feel it's super important to consider the impact of disparities research. And I mentioned this before, to set up deficit models in the quote marginalized community is hard, and it is a habit that I think we as practitioners are forever trying to shake. But I have benefited greatly from being well versed in strengths-based approaches and culturally sensitive methodologies. Almost all of the researchers that I was going to say no, but I'll say respect, and the people that are doing LGBTQ plus work are doing qualitative studies, and these are they're helpful for people in the Black community too. It reminds us that if we're coming in, especially as an outsider to a community, or even just with these preconceived notions of how things are, we end up imposing ideas and like making them fit into the frameworks that we have, when really there's a rich knowledge that could be taken from just looking at what people's experiences have been, and then make that be the framework. So one of the things that Jonathan Lasseter talked about was protective factors in the Black community, but he talks a lot about Black trans protective factors, and so I'll mention it here. And he talked about how important coping and social support were in navigating structural barriers of oppression and discrimination. And they specifically talked, it wasn't him, but it was somebody they quoted, talked specifically about house and ballroom communities. I forget what the drag term to this dance move that they're doing is, but like the kids used to call it 5,000 when you would like fall back on your leg like that. Anyways, but these communities were kind of centers of knowledge, and this kind of mirrors how community centers are in the Black community in general, like churches, barbershops, places like that, where not only is it a place where people can gather, but people are getting sex positive information, health protective information. People are checking up on them, like if they if they're having safe sex, things like that. And so the deep exploration and integration of stigmatized social identities in the Black community or sexual gender minorities facilitates the reframing of negative beliefs. And sometimes I think we can get caught up in thinking, well, if people don't think about these identities and the aspect of it, then they're better able to reframe. But I think knowing who you are and like all of those different aspects helps you to form the knowledge that you can live a happy and healthy life. So don't avoid. Marginalized communities and diverse identities do not have the same experiences. Like, we have similar journeys, I suppose, especially when you think about this political thing and just what, especially in the United States, the impact of marginalization has done, activism and stuff. But, you know, when I was doing my doctoral research, I came out here to Utah, and most of the time, so most of the people that I interviewed in person were white, and most of the time they assumed that I was not LDS. I'm like, what do you think a Black woman is doing out here interviewing you? Why do I have an interest in Mormons? But they like, people didn't ask. I didn't tell until later on, which, you know, probably was methodologically questionable, but I just kind of got tired of dealing with the assumptions. People would like explain aspects to the church more because they thought I wasn't part of a community. And I'm like, well, you know, whiteness continues regardless of like this marginalized identification, which is fine. I mean, this is life. That I think intersectional representation is essential for that reason, because there's going to be a lot of ways that a Black queer person understands the world that other people do not. And so people kind of need examples in their community and in their work lives too, of people that are bringing in this intersectional perspective. And I don't get this right all the time. I have my stuff, and I recognize that, you know, people that I see don't get it right all the time either. And being more open about these dynamics, I think, has just helped things go smoother. Affirmation is more than an attitude. It requires action and consistency. I'm gonna fly through these, but I was kind of philosophically thinking about, I have a kid right now who I identifies as cisgender, but has a gender expression that is typically associated with the opposite gender. And this person is sure about this. And sometimes I find myself in my head saying things like, well, we're biding time clinically until this person figures out which lane they stand in. And so I'm glad that Tyler, you know, reemphasized this, because like, affirmation and acceptance is me accepting that this is how this person is. Like, they're off on their own track. Like, they've got models that they're looking at for their journey, and I'm over here like stuck trying to prescribe into how I think it should go. And I think that we can all fall into this trap. But if we think about acceptance and affirmation as a continual process, and one that requires consistency, that it will help a lot. I think what was so popular about Caitlin Ryan's work, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with, is that it started with this kind of like, in the LDS tradition, they used to have this idea called building on common beliefs. And I feel like that's how like Dr. Ryan started out. So she assumes that families love their children and want them to have a good life. She's accepting and acknowledging that these hopes and dreams for kids are shaped by these expectations that are influenced by a lot of things, culture, beliefs, all kinds of things. And so the power of the Family Acceptance Project, when it came out, is that she really met families where they were. And I could just think of like, they just go out in this community in California, and they happen to get, I think this is how it happened anyway, my mind is old, they just happened to get a large LDS sample when they were going out and doing this work. And so then they're like, well, let's look at it. So then when they publish their materials, they have Family Acceptance Project just general, and then they have a Family Acceptance Project for LDS people specifically. And I think that around here, that version has been circulated so widely that people think that that's the only one. But that was their response to like trying to be culturally relevant and sensitive to what their work was yielding. And so that's a good example for all of us. And then of course, this model of acceptance and building on how, if most parents want their kids to have a healthy life, look at all these things that can happen when you accept your child. They believe that they can be happy adults. When you don't accept your child, the risk of them living a long life decreases by the amount of acceptance that you have. So putting these things, this gets at one of the questions that somebody had, putting it in a values consistent way for parents helps a lot. Sometimes I will tell LDS family specifically, like if you want an eternal family, like it starts today, eternity starts today. It's kind of hard to expect that things will just change when everybody's on the other side. So like, how can you build the relationships that you want right now? The Cat's-Wise study, oh my goodness, you guys have to read this. I put it in the suggested citations, but Sabra was inspired by Caitlin Ryan's work, and they did like a qualitative interview project with trans youth and their families, and they came up with all of these themes of just what they were experiencing. And the one thing, I had my husband read this too. I say, well, what would like stick out to you? Because this is important. We're dealing with like regular people, not just nerdy like therapists or whatever. And the things that he picked up on were like in this theme of identity processes. I think one area that I either disagree with Tyler or just want to get clarification on, when he said that generally it is gender that we're talking about and not sex. I think one of the biological contributions I look at as a woman is just like menstruation, and specifically in the trans community, like how something like menstruation or like normal puberty, normal, or like what your body is doing, puberty processes intersect with this gender identity and how that can be distressing. And so that was one thing he highlighted. The other thing was when we talk about support, a lot of these kids weren't wanting their families to do much different, but they were looking at like, they were almost shaping behavior and looking at just like small ways that their family showed that they accepted them. So being willing to go and self-educate. Somebody had a quote that talked about how their second cousin was very conservative, like pro-Confederate flag, uses the N word all the time. I have judgments. When we came out to him, he sat down for about 3 days straight and watched every single coming out video on YouTube so he could be the best person to me that he could be. And so like, educate. We all have this like knowledge at our fingertips. We can research. And then the last thing that I want to point out is just the impact of geography on getting resources for trans people specifically. Some of the people talked about how if you live in a certain state where maybe like, the gender clinic is 3 hours away, that's going to make a difference in like how they're able to explore and live life the way that they want to. There is such a thing as trans-affirming cognitive behavioral therapy that takes into account like affirming and trauma-informed perspectives. And so it's recognizing that, not saying that being trans is in and of itself bad, but that the interaction of that identity and oppression creates, like I said, an adverse experience, not unlike an ACE. And so when they do their work, they're emphasizing that in assessment to look at what their early learning experiences were around gender expression identity, including in psychoeducation, the impact of systemic oppression, which is important, and then modifying negative thinking through trans-affirming contexts. And, with like westernized approaches, I've been on Twitter lately, and CBT is getting a lot of flack for just not being particularly sensitive to the impact of systemic oppression, which I like tend to agree with, because a lot of the ways that we reframe things puts the impetus on the person to change internally. And so that really is a balance between acknowledging that systemic oppression is a thing and that there are ways that we can approach the world that lessen the impact of those things. And these are also things that we probably already talked about already. And then the last thing that I wanted to say is that creativity and transformation seems to be key to integrating spiritual practice into the lives of queer people who want it. One of my other favorite researchers is Eric Rodriguez, and he did in his career, he did a lot of stuff around sexual orientation identity and Christian identity. Now his trainees are doing stuff with Muslim folks, which I think is fascinating. And in both of those works, it talks about how people will often form scriptures or transform beliefs in ways that are kind of like overtly, almost as though they're like one body, one mind, like sexuality and their religious experience. They use scriptures to give credence to the empowerment of their identity. I don't know if that makes sense. I wrote it better on the slide so you can read it. I think that is it for me. And
that's it for, we've got resources on our slides that you'll get later if you want places to check out. But yeah, I don't know. Michael, thank you for hearing, and happy to stay in contact and answer, hang around here for some questions if there are any. But I think we're probably at time, so we should probably wrap up.
If you have questions, you can email either of us or put it on the Slido, and we'll figure out how to get the answer back to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Everyone.
Thank you, Tyler.
Yeah, it's so good to see you, Kimberly.
You too.